For half a century, nothing had stirred across this frozen stretch of the Arctic. The old navigation towers, steel frames buried in drifts, stood like bones from a forgotten era. Their fuel tanks had been emptied, their lamps removed, their purpose erased. They were meant to die quietly in the snow. And yet, in the spring of 1971, during one of the strongest solar storms of the decade, the impossible happened. Somebody, or something, seemed to turn them back on. It began with a glow, a faint ember on the horizon, then another, perfectly aligned, perfectly spaced, exactly where the beacon line once stood. A system with no power had reactivated, not dimly, not momentarily, but in a sequence, steady, timed, deliberate. For the men who witnessed it, this wasn't a trick of the aurora, nor a momentary reflection of drifting ice. It looked like an old Arctic runway coming back to life. And none of them could explain how. The first observation came from a Canadian weather technician on Elef Ringness Island. He stepped outside during a routine wind reading, expecting nothing but red auroras bleeding across the sky. But instead his attention snapped to a series of warm-toned pulses, low, near the horizon, rising and falling in a rhythm too organized to be natural. He watched in silence. The pulses repeated, then faded. He logged the event mechanically, as though writing would make it less strange. Hours later, a military transport aircraft flying north toward Alert Base encountered the same phenomenon. The co-pilot scanned the ice below and froze mid-sentence. "There," he said quietly, a steady amber flame. Then another far beyond it, then 3 more. The pilot circled to confirm. Instruments showed nothing. No working towers, no electrical signatures, no heat. Yet out the window, they could see 5 points of light, just bright enough to pierce the polar darkness. 5 lights in a row. 5 lights in the exact formation of a beacon chain, abandoned almost a decade earlier. The co-pilot later swore the spacing was perfect. Not approximate, perfect. He had flown these routes back when the beacons were active. He remembered their cadence, their behavior in storms, their warm acetylene glow. These lights matched them. But the acetylene tanks were removed in 1962. The ignition systems rusted away, and no one had serviced these towers since. So how were they burning? The solar storm that night was powerful enough to scramble long-range communications across Alaska. Pilots reported compass drift. Some flights rerouted entirely. Radio operators monitoring North America's northern channels described bursts of static that sounded like tearing metal. In isolated research stations, scientists noticed unusual readings in equipment that wasn't even powered. Oscillations, flickers, tiny spikes in dormant circuits. The storm was touching everything. Even dead instruments twitched. But nothing behaved as strangely as the old beacon line. Witnesses insisted these were not random flares or atmospheric reflections. The lights appeared in sequence. They maintained distance and timing. They formed a navigational corridor that had not existed, officially, for years. And the detail that disturbed investigators most. The lights glowed with the same warm hue as acetylene flame, something that was physically impossible after decades of exposure. When a small investigation team reached the site days later, the storm had passed. The landscape was silent except for the dull crunch of ice under their boots. Tower 1 was found collapsed, nothing more than twisted metal. But at Tower 2, the place where pilots reported the brightest glow, the team paused. The frame was sheathed in frost. The lamp housing was cracked open like an eggshell. Snow filled every crevice. But beneath all of that, faintly, was a sound. A slow, irregular, metallic tick. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't thermal cracking. It wasn't anything the tower should have been capable of making. It sounded like a mechanism trying, weakly, stubbornly, to start again after half a century asleep. The team exchanged uneasy glances. If the lights were just an illusion, then why did the tower sound alive? And if they weren't an illusion, what exactly had reawakened them? The team reached the beacon field in the late afternoon, under a pale sun that barely warmed the air. They expected silence, just the wind scraping across frozen metal. Instead, they felt something else the moment they stepped between the towers. A pressure, subtle but undeniable, as if the air carried a memory. They split into pairs and began examining the structures one by one. Most had collapsed under decades of storms. Steel braces were folded inward, bolts sheared by frost. Nothing suggested life or warmth or motion. But the second tower, always the second one, held their attention. The metallic ticking they heard earlier hadn't stopped. It grew clearer as they chipped away layers of ice from the lower frame. The rhythm wasn't steady. It hesitated, then resumed, like a pulse struggling to find its beat. One of the technicians knelt beside the housing, leaned in, and closed his eyes to listen. A few seconds passed. When he opened them again, he looked unsettled. "It's not expanding metal," he said quietly. "It's coming from inside the lamp cylinder." Inside a lamp that had no fuel, no ignition, no functioning mechanism left. Something was moving in there, or reacting, or remembering. They continued the inspection, expecting at any moment to uncover the simple truth. A loose panel, a shard of ice tapping against metal, a temperature shift creating contraction clicks. But no physical explanation held. When they opened the housing, they found the lamp chamber packed with snow so dense it felt like stone. Nothing inside could have moved. And yet the sound continued, soft and persistent, from somewhere deep within the tower's spine. One member suggested that the solar storm may have induced electrical currents through the metal frame. But the beacons had never been wired. They were chemical lamps, simple, rugged, and completely independent of external power. And even if induced currents were possible, they wouldn't produce a timed, pulsing cadence. Not like this. As they documented the tower, the wind dropped suddenly. The air felt heavier, thick with static. A faint vibration worked its way up through their boots, so slight they almost missed it. Then, 200 meters away, another tower emitted a sharp crack that echoed across the ice. They turned in unison. A thin column of frost drifted from the top of the fourth beacon, spiraling like smoke in the still air. For a moment, no one moved. The team lead finally broke the silence. "Check it," he said. And they did. What they found inside the fourth tower was stranger still. The lamp well, long empty, was coated with a thin layer of soot, fresh soot, black, powdery, and unmistakably recent. There was no viable fuel source, no ignition residue, no chemical burn marks, just soot, as if something had smoldered low and slow, without a flame. How could a lamp burn when its fuel had been removed half a century earlier? The team recorded every detail, each note raising more questions than answers. As they worked, daylight slipped away. The temperature dropped sharply. The horizon dimmed until the world seemed carved from blue glass. Then the fog rolled in, a slow, creeping mass that swallowed the plane tower by tower. Visibility collapsed to 30 meters. Their breath turned to vapor instantly. Radios crackled with static, then cut out. The environment changed so fast it felt unnatural. One technician muttered that the solar storm might still be interfering with magnetic fields. Another wondered if ice crystals were refracting atmospheric light. Maybe the lights the pilots saw had been illusions after all. But even as they reassured themselves, none forgot the ticking, or the soot, or the pressure that seemed to deepen between the towers. As the fog thickened, an eerie glow spread across the sky. Not bright, but enough to silver the snow. The team looked up, expecting the aurora to ripple overhead. But the light wasn't in the sky. It was on the ground. Somewhere beyond the fog, a soft, amber pulse shimmered. Brief, faint, and unmistakably artificial. The technicians froze. The lead whispered, "Did you all see that?" Another pulse. A little closer this time. It wasn't a flame. It wasn't reflection. It wasn't atmospheric. It was a signal, or the echo of one, coming from a direction no beacon should have been standing in. The team turned toward it, hearts pounding, the silence between them sharpened by fear and curiosity in equal measure. Something out there, something buried in the ice, had just answered. And the question that now haunted every step was simple. If the beacons weren't alive, then what was lighting the snow? The amber pulse faded as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the fog. For a moment, the team simply stood there, listening. The Arctic is never truly silent. There is always the distant hiss of wind, the crack of settling ice. But in that instant, even those sounds seemed to draw back, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath. The lead investigator raised his hand. "Stay together," he whispered. And they moved. Snow crunched under their boots in slow, deliberate steps. Every dozen meters the fog parted just enough to reveal a sliver of the horizon. A curve of steel from a collapsed tower. A mound of drifted ice. The faint silhouette of another beacon half buried. Nothing seemed alive. Nothing suggested the faintest spark of energy. But then the pulse returned. A soft, warm glow, farther away now, but unmistakable. One of the technicians exhaled sharply. "It's moving," he murmured. But it wasn't moving. It was appearing, in places where no known structure existed. The team adjusted course, heading toward the last glow they'd seen. Compass needles jittered with the lingering effects of the solar storm. Their radios hissed and spat, as if something nearby was muting frequencies. The deeper they walked, the heavier the static became. And then, faintly, came another sound. Not ticking, not cracking metal. Something slower. Almost like breath passing through a narrow vent. They followed it. The fog thinned just enough to expose a dark, rounded shape rising from the snow. Not a beacon tower, not a storage crate. Something smaller, older, cylindrical, like a steel drum driven halfway into the ice. None of them recognized it. The laird brushed away the snow with his glove. The surface underneath was smoother than the towers, less corroded. He scraped harder and revealed a number plate etched into the metal. A number none of them expected. 7. There had only ever been 6 beacons in this field. No maps showed a 7th. No supply logs. No construction records. No flight reports. Nothing in either nation's archives suggested the existence of a 7th navigational marker. Yet here it was, rising from the snow, as if it had been waiting. They circled it cautiously. The cylinder was sealed. No openings, no lamp housing, no wiring. Just a solid structure that shouldn't have been here. Then the glow returned, this time from inside the ice beneath it. A soft bloom of amber, thin as a whisper, radiating upward through the permafrost. The technicians stepped back instinctively. The light pulsed once, then faded again. The lead crouched, pressed a gloved hand to the snow, and felt a faint warmth. "How is there heat here?" someone muttered. The cylinder wasn't warm. The air wasn't warm. The ground wasn't warm. Only the patch directly beneath this mysterious seventh marker carried the faintest trace of rising temperature. They dug. Shovels scraped ice, cutting down a few inches at a time. The moment they reached denser layers, the equipment began to behave strangely, not failing, but resisting, as if the ice had grown tougher, almost rubber-like. A technician switched to a steel probe and drove it downward. A hollow clang echoed from below. Whatever was buried under Tower 7 was metal. The team exchanged a look. Whatever they were dealing with went far beyond abandoned infrastructure. Something was beneath this beacon. Something sealed. Something that hadn't been listed in any operational record. They cleared more snow until they could see the outline of a delicate circular hatch embedded in the ice. Its edges were fused solid, but the design was unmistakable. A Cold War-era sealed access panel, and on its rim, barely visible, were 3 triangles arranged in a pattern none of them recognized. "What is this doing under a beacon line?" one whispered. Before anyone could answer, the static in their radios spiked sharply. A harsh burst of interference tore through the speakers. The needles on every compass spun once, violently, then stalled. Then, silence. The wind died. The fog stilled, and a weak amber glow leaked from the hatch seams, like the dying heartbeat of something buried far below. The technicians stepped back. No one dared touch it again. In the thick, unnatural quiet, the lead finally spoke. This wasn't part of the navigation system. Someone hid this here. A single question now overshadowed all the earlier mysteries. The reactivated lights, the soot, the ticking metal, the shifting fog. If this sealed structure beneath Beacon 7 was never meant to be found, what awakened it during the solar storm? And more unsettling still, was it waking up on its own? For several seconds, none of the investigators dared move. The faint amber glow seeping from the hatch below. Beacon 7 pulsed with a slow rhythm. Too slow to be electrical, too steady to be random. It felt almost biological, as if the thing buried beneath the ice was breathing. Then the glow vanished, leaving only the sound of frost settling and the soft hiss of wind returning to the plain. The lead investigator broke the silence with a steady breath. "We record everything," he said. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that the structure beneath their feet was listening. They marked the perimeter and started clearing more snow around the hatch, careful not to disturb the metal directly. The deeper they dug, the more the shape revealed itself. The access panel wasn't part of a tower foundation or a supply cache. It extended far wider, almost like the top of a buried capsule, designed to lie undetected under the permafrost. A technician tapped the metal with his probe. Instead of the dull thud of thick steel, the echo returned strangely hollow, like tapping on a pressurized chamber. "That's not a beacon component," he murmured. And everyone knew he was right. They radioed base for structural diagrams, hoping for a match. None came. Nothing in the historical schematics resembled what they'd found. The beacon line had been simple, rugged, intentionally primitive. There was no reason, no operational logic, for a sealed substructure beneath it. Unless it wasn't part of the beacon line at all. As they worked, the temperature dropped sharply. Breath turned to fog in front of their masks. The sky dimmed until the world looked carved from cold iron. A low rumble rolled beneath the ice, so soft they weren't sure if they'd imagined it. Then it came again, firmer this time, as though the ground itself were shifting. The team stepped back instinctively. A microquake, ice fracture, or something responding to their digging. Whatever it was, it hadn't been there an hour ago. The technician with the ground scanner powered it up, though he doubted it would function in the storm's residual interference. The screen flickered, static crawling across the surface, but then the display stabilized enough to show a rough image. Beneath the hatch, nestled deep in the ice, was an elongated structure, metallic, cylindrical, running parallel to the ground. It stretched far beyond Beacon 7, disappearing into the frozen earth. One of them whispered, "It's a line." A buried line. Not electrical, not fiber, something thicker, something older. The solar storm earlier in the week had produced extreme geomagnetic currents known to travel along conductive pathways, the kind used in forgotten early warning systems, the kind abandoned half a century ago and never documented publicly. If a remnant of that network still existed, and the storm had energized it, what else could have awakened? The technician adjusted the scanner's gain. The structure beneath them flickered in and out of clarity. It wasn't a pipeline. It wasn't a cable. It was closer to a reinforced conduit, built to transmit or shield something. The lead investigator leaned closer to the display. "If this carried signals," he said slowly, "then it wasn't part of the surface navigation grid. This was something else, entirely." A pause settled over them. The air grew heavy, charged with the same static they'd felt earlier. Compass needles twitched again. The scanner beeped erratically. Then the hatch glowed. Not bright, not long. Just a single soft pulse, pushing up through the ice like a heartbeat beneath white skin. Every member froze. Seconds later, the ground beneath their boots shivered. A thin crack streaked away from the hatch, sketching a jagged line toward the horizon, before fading back into the snow. Someone whispered, "It's active." No one argued. They took readings until their instruments began to fail, screens flickering, coils heating, needles stalling mid-sweep. The solar storm's tail was still sweeping across the Arctic, and whatever lay below them seemed to react to it. When they attempted to retreat toward Beacon 4, their radios sprang to life. A faint tone bled through the static, a rising, falling pattern. Not speech, not noise, a signal, soft, weak, yet unmistakably intentional. It repeated twice, then cut to silence. The team stared down at the hatch, chilled in a way the wind could not explain. If the buried structure was transmitting, they had just become the first humans in decades to hear its voice. What had it been built for? Why was it hidden beneath a navigation tower line? And if the storm had only awakened a fraction of it, what would happen when the next surge hit? The amber glow returned one last time, brief, like a warning blinking through the snow. And for the first time, the team realized that they might not be investigating a malfunction or a remnant of old technology. They might be standing on top of the Arctic's forgotten communication spine, one that was never meant to shut down, and was finally remembering its purpose. The storm intensified through the night, but the team stayed near Beacon 7, too afraid and too compelled to leave the discovery behind. Their instruments had nearly all failed, leaving only the scanner with its flickering, fragile display. The buried line beneath the ice pulsed faintly on the screen, stretching farther than they could trace, vanishing into the permafrost like a vein. The lead investigator stared at the hatch beneath his boots and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel earlier. Unease. Not because of the glow, not because of the signals, but because the design of the sealed structure, didn't match anything in their archives. This wasn't built for navigation. It wasn't built for surface communication. It wasn't built to guide pilots or ships. It was built for something deeper. He tried the radio again. Only static answered. Until a single, soft tone bled through, 3 rising notes, each separated by a breath of silence. They listened. The tone repeated. Then once more, slightly stronger. Every head turned toward the ground. It was coming from below. They widened the clearing around the hatch until they could uncover more of its rim. As fresh snow drifted in, they brushed it away quickly. The access panel had no hinges, no manual handle, no mechanism visible from the surface. It had been sealed with intention, locked so thoroughly that only the right set of tools or the right frequency could ever open it. One of the technicians tapped the hatch with his glove. The vibration spread faintly outward, like ripples on a frozen lake. The ground responded with a low hum, soft, almost curious. The buried line was not just active, it was interactive. Snowflakes drifted around them, carried by a sudden wind that fell just as quickly. The temperature dropped hard. Their breath thickened into clouds. The lead stepped back and whispered, "This wasn't a beacon field at all. The beacons were camouflage." And the moment the words left his mouth, the pieces finally aligned. The beacon line was placed in a straight corridor. The buried structure followed the same path. The towers above were cheap, replaceable, forgettable. But beneath them sat something engineered to endure, something hidden in plain sight. A technician crouched again, tracing the triangular symbols etched around the hatch. They weren't military markings. They weren't navigational codes. They resembled early research symbols, classification markers used for experimental communications, buried far from population centers. It hit them all at once. This wasn't a navigation network. It was a testbed. A Cold War experiment buried beneath Arctic ice, built to send or receive signals through the ground rather than the air, shielded from interference, invisible to foreign intelligence, and silent unless activated by the right external force. And now, for the first time in 50 years, the sun itself had awakened it. The next question was much harder. What was it broadcasting? A sudden tremor rippled through the ground, throwing ice dust into the air. The amber glow flickered beneath the hatch, quickly rising, then dimming, like a failing heartbeat. One technician stumbled back, nearly losing his footing. The scanner beeped erratically, struggling to interpret whatever was happening below. The buried line now showed intermittent surges, short bursts of energy moving along its length. Not random, not environmental, directed. The lead stared at the readings in disbelief. "The line is transmitting," he whispered. "It's sending something." Another tremor, another pulse. The glow beneath the hatch brightened enough to illuminate the snow around their boots. Every instinct told them to retreat. Every curiosity begged them to stay. Then, as abruptly as it began, everything stopped. The pulses, the tremors, the glow. Silence returned, thick and absolute. The team waited. Nothing. The buried structure had gone dormant again. But not dead. Never dead. They knew now that the solar storm hadn't created the phenomenon. It had only jump-started a system designed to operate under extreme electromagnetic conditions, conditions strong enough to penetrate ice, earth, and metal. A system built to last, built to hide, built to outlive the men who constructed it. In their final report, the team noted the location, the readings, and the inexplicable signs of activation. They left out the tone they heard through the radio, 3 notes rising in sequence. They left out the warmth beneath their feet. They left out the feeling that the structure responded not mechanically, but intentionally. Those details were passed verbally, from one analyst to another, until they reached a point in the chain where the safest decision was simply to close the file. The beacon field remained abandoned. The towers eventually collapsed. The ice shifted and covered Beacon 7 again. But deep beneath the frozen plain, the forgotten line still lies buried, quiet now, waiting for conditions strong enough to stir it again. And if another solar storm of that magnitude ever sweeps across the Arctic, what message will rise through the ice next time? In the decades since that storm, the Arctic has shifted, the towers have collapsed, and the beacon field has returned to silence. Yet the structure beneath Beacon 7 remains sealed in ice, its purpose still unknown. Whatever woke during that night in 1971 didn't vanish. It simply went dormant again. And if the sun ever strikes the Earth with the same force, the question won't be whether the line still works, but who or what it was built to reach.